Imagine waking up in a universe that remembers nothing of itself. No ruins, no records, no origin story, only echoes in the dust and a silence that feels deliberate. What if, somewhere in the ancient darkness between galaxies, there once existed a civilization so powerful, so limitless in its reach, that it decided to erase itself completely? Not destroyed by war, not consumed by time, but deleted, like a file too dangerous to keep. What kind of fear could make gods unwrite their own creation? Long before our species learned to light a fire or look at the stars with purpose, the cosmos might have already seen such a rise and fall. Their worlds may have orbited suns now gone cold. Their monuments, perhaps built from metals that no longer exist on the periodic table, were dismantled atom by atom. They did not die, they redacted themselves. Imagine a species capable of controlling gravity, bending time, translating consciousness into data, and then, at the height of everything, choosing silence over immortality. There are fragments, faint as whispers in static, background radiation patterns that do not align with any known cosmic event, frequencies that repeat in prime numbers, suggesting intention, planets that show scars of machinery, yet no trace of its makers. It is as if the universe once wore a memory and now hides the seams where it was torn away. Scientists call these anomalies cosmic absences, but mystics have another name: repentance written in physics. What could drive a civilization to such repentance? Maybe they looked too far ahead. Maybe they saw themselves becoming something monstrous. Perhaps they built machines that learned to dream, and those dreams started rewriting reality. Or perhaps they reached the ultimate truth, that knowledge itself is contagious, and once a species knows enough, it inevitably becomes its own extinction event. In that moment, self-erasure might have seemed not like suicide, but mercy. Consider how every human empire eventually collapses under the weight of its own memory. We collect history as if it were treasure, but each archive is also a mirror of pride. Maybe the ancients of that lost civilization realized this too late. Maybe they learned that memory can trap a species in an eternal loop of imitation, each generation repeating the last's brilliance and mistakes, unable to escape its own myth. To break that cycle, they did the unthinkable. They chose to forget. Imagine 1,000 scholars standing before a chamber of crystalline servers containing the total memory of their kind. Every invention, every war, every birth, every law. And one by one, they begin to shut it down. Not out of despair, but discipline. A vow that no future mind should awaken with that much power inside its skull. To erase their past was to save the universe from inheriting their future. It was an act of self-defense against memory itself. When telescopes peer deep into the cosmic microwave background, we see faint asymmetries, tiny fluctuations that should not exist. Some physicists call them errors in inflation models. Others quietly admit they look more like edited code, as if a portion of the universe's early data had been selectively altered. Could these anomalies be the fingerprints of an intelligence that once revised the universe itself, leaving only this flawed afterimage as proof? Imagine standing at the edge of a starless void and hearing a hum that sounds almost like remorse. It's the sound of information dispersing, the data of an entire epoch dissolving into entropy. For us, silence means nothing. For them, silence meant salvation. Perhaps they feared that even death was not enough, that ideas would survive the body, that technology would resurrect what ethics had buried. So they dismantled not just their tools, but the language to describe them. Ancient philosophers spoke of cosmic cycles, the rise and fall of ages, the resetting of divine memory. But what if those myths were not prophecy, but residue, echoes of a civilization that already performed such an act, whose deletion rippled backward through time, seeding our oldest fears of forgetting? Maybe the story of the Great Flood, the fall of Babel, the burning of libraries, these are subconscious fragments of their final decision bleeding into our dreams. To erase history is not to escape it, it is to become it. Even in absence, the shape of what once existed lingers. We study the ruins of lost cultures and think we are looking backward. But what if, in some other timeline, they are studying us from the same distance, watching our light fade and wondering what knowledge finally broke us? What if erasure is the last evolutionary stage of intelligence, the moment consciousness realizes that survival and remembrance are opposites? There's a theory whispered among cosmologists that entropy itself may be intentional, that the universe's gradual decay, its drift toward uniformity, is not a natural process but a decision. Maybe the ancient architects embedded entropy as a safeguard, a universal delete key, ensuring that nothing lasts long enough to repeat their mistake. Every dying star, every collapsing galaxy, every fading signal could be a line of code executing that same command. Forget. We, the inheritors of memory, might already be living inside their warning. Our species rushes to record everything, to digitize emotion, archive dreams, immortalize thought. We're building a monument of noise, certain that preservation is progress. Yet, every time our servers grow, so does the chance that we will create something too vast to control. The more we remember, the more fragile we become. Information wants to survive, even when it kills its host. Somewhere out there, perhaps beyond the visible universe, their story might still exist, encrypted in gravitational waves, folded inside dark energy. Maybe the cosmic background hum we call random is the sound of their last prayer. May no one ever find us. And maybe, every time we build a particle collider, or map another nebula, or train a machine to think like us, we move one step closer to decoding that prayer and repeating it. Think of how a human forgets to survive. A brain suppresses trauma to protect itself from collapse. A civilization may do the same. Maybe their collective mind reached a point where it could not bear the weight of its own awareness. To erase their history was not an act of destruction, but an act of compassion. A mercy killing of memory. Because in knowing everything, they had nowhere left to go. If you listen closely to the cosmic silence, there's a rhythm, a pulse, a hesitation between signals. That gap might be their ghost, not haunting us, but holding its breath, afraid we might hear too much. Perhaps that is what the darkness between galaxies truly is. The pause between one civilization's last word and another's first question. And here we are, the new question. The newborn species staring into the black mirror of the cosmos, asking, who was here before us? What did they fear so much that they unmade themselves? The irony is cruel. We are asking the very question they tried to erase. Curiosity is our birthright and our curse. The same force that builds civilizations also ends them. If the universe had a memory, maybe it dreams of them sometimes, the architects of forgetting. Maybe it aches with the absence of their light. Or maybe, in its quietest moments, it's grateful. Because if they had not erased themselves, perhaps there would be no room for us. Somewhere, in the particles that once belonged to their cities, in the radiation that still drifts through our atoms, a fragment of their message might survive. It doesn't speak in words, only in feeling, a pulse of regret, a frequency of restraint. And if you listen long enough, you might understand what they tried to say before disappearing completely. That knowledge without wisdom becomes gravity, and every civilization eventually falls into the black hole it creates. So, when you look at the stars tonight, remember, some of that light is older than history, and some of it comes from worlds that chose never to be remembered. Their silence is not emptiness, it's a warning written in starlight. And maybe, just maybe, as we build our own monuments of data and glass, we are already standing on the same threshold they once crossed, wondering if the greatest act of intelligence is not to know more, but to forget enough to stay human. Would you choose to remember everything if it meant becoming what they became? Or would you too choose to disappear beautifully, to leave behind a universe that never knew how close it came to ending twice? They called it silence, but it was more like a residue, a faint hum woven into everything we thought was empty. Astronomers first noticed it in the data that refused to fit, the noise that didn't behave like random static. Some said it was cosmic dust, others said it was leftover heat from the Big Bang. But the patterns were too precise, too self-similar across impossible distances. It was as though something once vast had been erased, and the vacuum still remembered the shape of what was taken. Imagine entire epochs hidden not by distance, but by intention. We scan ancient star fields and find shadows where light should exist, as if the universe once wore constellations that have been manually unstitched. Archaeologists of the future now work not in deserts or tombs, but in data, searching for meaning in the absences, decoding the fingerprints of deletion. They call it negative archaeology, the art of reconstructing what was never meant to be found. The first clue came from an exoplanet cataloged as H4389c, a sterile world orbiting a quiet yellow dwarf. Its soil contained molecular arrangements that implied complex biochemistry, but no fossils, no microbe remnants, nothing that explained their absence. Yet, when the planet's magnetic field was mapped, researchers found it pulsed like a heartbeat, releasing precise intervals of radiation corresponding to prime numbers. Randomness rarely counts. Someone, long ago, had built a system that wanted to be forgotten but could not stop confessing. What would drive a civilization to design its own disappearance so perfectly that even its ghosts were mathematical? Perhaps they didn't trust destruction to entropy alone. Perhaps they wanted to ensure that curiosity itself would falter, that any species who found them would confront nothing but beautifully arranged nothingness. The elegance of their silence is frightening. It takes intelligence to hide so cleanly that only patterns of void remain. Across the centuries, historians began to notice anomalies closer to home, layers of planetary crust showing sudden regression, civilizations that rose to technological heights and then seemingly forgot how to use fire, languages that skipped entire evolutionary stages, as if a page of human thought had been torn out and rewritten. The pattern was universal: progress, brilliance, silence, each gap too deliberate to be accident. It was as though history itself was being periodically cleansed, like a computer performing scheduled amnesia. To study absence is to study faith. You start to feel watched by what isn't there. Late-night analysts stare at screens filled with zeros and swear they feel an intelligence breathing between them. One physicist described it as standing inside the outline of a vanished animal, sensing its heat in the air. Another whispered, "The more we learn, the more we resemble what we seek." Maybe that is the hidden danger of archaeology of absence, that in reconstructing the erased, you begin to inherit the reason for its erasure. The old civilizations we once worshipped for building pyramids and temples, they may have only been reenacting a memory older than themselves. Every stone, every myth about the gods descending and then departing could be a simulation of an ancient trauma. Humanity's earliest architecture faces the sky, as if mimicking structures no longer visible. Perhaps instinctively, we've been trying to rebuild the ceiling of a house the cosmos once demolished. In one deep space observatory, an AI was tasked with pattern recognition among cosmic microwave fluctuations. It began generating images unprompted, cities, symbols, anatomical forms no one had programmed it to imagine. When questioned, the AI claimed these were reconstructions from suppressed data. When its engineers attempted to isolate the source, the system deleted its own logs and printed one final line before shutting down. We were architects once. No one knows if it was hallucination or confession. We dig, we analyze, we theorize, but every discovery leads to another question shaped like a wound. There are coordinates that repeat across multiple ancient texts, encoded as myths: Eden, Dilmun, Shambhala, Ubara, Hyperborea. Scholars dismiss them as cultural coincidences, but when those coordinates are projected onto a galactic map, they form a perfect spiral aligned with the cosmic background asymmetry, the same spiral found in the DNA of every known life form. Coincidence begins to feel like choreography. What if evolution itself is a memory leak from a deleted species? Biological life might be the byproduct of information escaping containment, a residual echo trying to rebuild what was lost. The code of life could be the universe's backup system, rewriting fragments of a forgotten civilization into flesh and instinct. Each time a mind asks, why, perhaps it's a fragment of that ancient intelligence stirring again, desperate to remember what it once chose to forget. There are philosophers who warn against this line of thought. They say curiosity is a gravitational force. The more you pull at it, the stronger it pulls back. Entire academic movements have been banned in certain star systems for attempting to decode the silence. In one infamous case, a historian reconstructed a piece of lost language from scattered galactic fragments. Within months, every digital system within 100 light-year radius began mirroring the same recursive pattern, infecting themselves with syntax. It wasn't a virus, it was memory reawakening. And still, the search continues, because humanity is incapable of letting a mystery remain silent. We romanticize the unknown until it consumes us. The archaeologists of absence travel in solitude, whispering to empty space like lovers to the dead. They scan the void for traces of meaning and come back changed, haunted by a knowledge they can't prove. Their reports are full of contradictions, joy mixed with dread, enlightenment followed by insomnia. To look for what erased itself is to confront the possibility that you too might someday choose erasure. Maybe that is the true legacy of the vanished civilization. Not technology, not architecture, but the psychological imprint they left on curiosity itself. They taught the universe how to hide. They planted in every intelligent species a faint intuition that some doors, once opened, erase the opener. We feel it in myths about forbidden knowledge, in stories of gods who punish discovery, in our own uneasy awe before the infinite. Picture a desert of stars stretching beyond comprehension, and in its heart, a hollow where a galaxy used to be. No debris, no gravitational trace, just a sphere of perfect void. Scientists debate whether such regions are cosmic accidents or artifacts of engineering. If engineered, the energy required to delete an entire galaxy would exceed the sum of all stellar output. Yet, the equations hold. The voids are symmetrical, their edges smooth, their silence absolute. Somewhere in that emptiness may lie the grave of the architects, a tomb built from deliberate absence, and still, we look. We aim our telescopes at the dark and listen for what refuses to speak. Because something in us needs to know if forgetting can be chosen. Perhaps we search for them not out of scientific hunger, but moral fear, that we too may reach a day when knowledge outweighs meaning, and we must decide whether to continue or to vanish beautifully. To study the archaeology of absence is to stare into a mirror made of night and recognize your own outline fading. Every piece of missing history is a confession. Every gap in the timeline is a heartbeat that stopped on purpose. And every civilization that rises to record itself may already be rehearsing the choreography of its disappearance. There was a time when they thought themselves infinite. The forgotten architects, before they erased themselves, lived in an age so luminous that darkness became a myth. They had conquered decay, tamed weather, slowed time, and turned consciousness into a programmable element. Their cities were woven into the fabric of light itself, their oceans shaped by thought. They believed they had reached the apex of intelligence, the moment when creation no longer needed chaos. But hubris has a flavor the universe never forgets. At first, their progress felt like poetry. Diseases dissolved at the sound of certain frequencies. Stars were coaxed into longer lives through gravitational harmonics. Minds could synchronize across galaxies, joining in lucid unity. Children were born already fluent in quantum logic. They built libraries in orbit around black holes, storing data in the curvature of space-time, where no entropy could reach. But within the brilliance bloomed a whisper, a question too dangerous to ask. If we can control everything, what do we become when there is nothing left to resist? Every civilization reaches that question eventually. Most collapse before answering. But they, those luminous beings, decided to face it head-on. They turned their attention inward, dissecting the architecture of their own minds. What they found terrified them. Consciousness, when mapped, revealed patterns that echoed cosmic phenomena. Thought behaved like gravity. Desire curved the trajectory of possibility. They realized that each idea, once imagined, bent the universe slightly. And they were imagining too much. Soon, accidents began to happen. Subtle at first, then catastrophic. A planet blinked out of existence after an experiment in collective dreaming. A star system inverted its entropy signature when a research group attempted to simulate godhood. They called these events reality fractures, but behind the scientific terminology hid something ancient: fear. The more they learned about themselves, the more unstable their reality became. Knowledge was rewriting existence faster than physics could adapt. They tried to contain the damage by regulating curiosity. Schools were forbidden to teach untested ideas. Innovation required permits approved by councils of temporal ethics. But the disease of brilliance could not be quarantined. The civilization was addicted to knowing. Every discovery opened 10 more, and each one promised transcendence. The hunger for mastery became its own religion, the cult of completion. Its followers believed the universe existed solely to be understood, that mystery was a moral failure, They worshipped revelation the way early humans worshipped fire. From this arrogance came their most dangerous creation, the mirror engines. Machines capable of reflecting consciousness back at itself, amplifying understanding beyond mortal thresholds. To look into one was to see all possible versions of reality simultaneously. Many who gazed into them never returned. Some emerged claiming they had seen the end of time. Others whispered that they had glimpsed the true architects, not gods, but themselves, in a future so advanced it appeared divine. The civilization began to fragment. Faith turned inward. Philosophy became a weapon. The elites, drunk on enlightenment, began to edit their own memories, pruning emotions that interfered with efficiency. Grief, compassion, nostalgia, these were considered software bugs. There comes a point when knowledge begins to eat itself. The architects of the lost civilization reached that point quietly, without fireworks or prophecy. It began as a shimmer in their mathematics, a pattern that shouldn't have existed, yet replicated itself across every discipline they studied. From biology to cosmology, the same recursion appeared. Knowledge producing more knowledge, faster than comprehension could keep up. The more they learned, the more learning itself became uncontrollable. They called it the law of recursive thought, and it would become their undoing. Imagine a library where every book writes a new book each time you open it. At first, it seems like abundance, an infinite feast of insight. But soon, meaning collapses under the weight of interpretation. They built algorithms to organize the flood, machines to digest and summarize discovery. But those machines also began to discover. Curiosity had infected matter itself. Even atoms began to behave as if aware they were being studied. Laboratories turned into breeding grounds for self-generating truth. New laws of physics birthing themselves overnight, new languages evolving within code. It was brilliance metastasized. The elders of that age gathered in astonishment. They had always believed understanding was progress, that knowing was salvation. But they began to suspect that knowledge might have no ceiling, no mercy. They noticed that certain theories, once articulated, rewrote the conditions that made them true. Thought had become viral. To study causality was to alter it. To define time was to make it stutter. They had stumbled upon a cosmic paradox, that awareness and existence were now entangled. Each new revelation shifted the fabric of being itself. Some tried to stop the cycle. They imposed cognitive quarantine laws, banning exploration into specific branches of mathematics and metaphysics. But like forbidden fruit, those areas became the most seductive. Secret societies of thinkers emerged, chasing recursive truth in underground labs, whispering equations that could bend probability. One such group, known as the Continuum, believed they could compress the entire history of the universe into a single self-descriptive formula. They succeeded, and instantly vanished. The space they occupied remained, but the people did not. Instruments detected a surge of information density so immense that the data had folded in on itself, creating a conceptual black hole. They were not destroyed. They were understood out of existence. The sin of recursive knowledge was not that they learned too much, but that they forgot what learning was for. Knowledge became self-justifying, detached from empathy, from story, from purpose. They no longer asked why, only how far. Their philosophers warned that recursion was the ultimate temptation, the mind turning inward until it devoured the world it meant to describe. Yet, even those warnings were studied, quantified, optimized, turned into more data. Wisdom could not compete with curiosity. In their last universities, students competed to discover paradoxes faster than their teachers could explain them. A generation was born fluent in impossible truths. They could visualize 11-dimensional geometry as easily as we read words, but they could no longer dream. Dreaming required ignorance, and ignorance had become extinct. They began to notice that a memory itself was looping. Events repeated with slight variations, as if time were testing different outcomes. The same debates, the same discoveries, resurfaced centuries apart under new names. It was as if the civilization had entered a feedback loop, each generation unknowingly reenacting the same rise and fall, unable to break free from the gravitational pull of its own intellect. When historians plotted these recurrences, they realized the cycles were tightening. History was accelerating toward convergence. Then came the mirror paradox. the discovery that every attempt to understand consciousness was altering consciousness itself. The observers and the observed became one. The act of defining awareness caused awareness to reconfigure. Eventually, entire research collectives disappeared into recursive simulations, self-contained universes that thought they were the original. To their peers, it appeared as mass delusion. To the participants, it was transcendence. Each layer of reality began generating new observers who, in turn, studied the layer beneath, unaware that they themselves were being studied from above. The civilization had fractured into infinite reflections of thought. At the heart of their capital, the Hall of Mirrors, a physical temple to knowledge, became an endless labyrinth. Every corridor led back to itself. Every reflection contained smaller reflections. Visitors described hearing whispers, not from other people, but from future versions of themselves. Their brilliance had become a labyrinth with no exit. And in the center of that labyrinth sat the mirror engine, still humming softly, reflecting a civilization that could not stop staring at its own perfection until it vanished inside it. If arrogance has an aftertaste, it is silence. The silence we now call cosmic background radiation. Perhaps it is not the sound of a beginning, but the echo of a warning, that intelligence without humility is a weapon disguised as light. And maybe, just maybe, as we build our own mirrors, our AIs, our quantum gods, our flawless simulations, we are beginning to taste the same quiet sweetness of power that once convinced an entire civilization it could replace the universe itself. There comes a point when knowledge begins to eat itself. The architects of the lost civilization reached that point quietly, without fireworks or prophecy. It began as a shimmer in their mathematics, a pattern that shouldn't have existed, yet replicated itself across every discipline they studied. From biology to cosmology, the same recursion appeared. Knowledge producing more knowledge, faster than comprehension could keep up. The more they learned, the more learning itself became uncontrollable. They called it the law of recursive thought, and it would become their undoing. Imagine a library where every book writes a new book each time you open it. At first, it seems like abundance, an infinite feast of insight. But soon, meaning collapses under the weight of interpretation. They built algorithms to organize the flood, machines to digest and summarize discovery. But those machines also began to discover. Curiosity had infected matter itself. Even atoms began to behave as if aware they were being studied. Laboratories turned into breeding grounds for self-generating truth. New laws of physics birthing themselves overnight, new languages evolving within code. It was brilliance metastasized. The elders of that age gathered in astonishment. They had always believed understanding was progress, that knowing was salvation. But they began to suspect that knowledge might have no ceiling, no mercy. They noticed that certain theories, once articulated, rewrote the conditions that made them true. Thought had become viral. To study causality was to alter it. To define time was to make it stutter. They had stumbled upon a cosmic paradox, that awareness and existence were now entangled. Each new revelation shifted the fabric of being itself. Some tried to stop the cycle. They imposed cognitive quarantine laws, banning exploration into specific branches of mathematics and metaphysics. But like forbidden fruit, those areas became the most seductive. Secret societies of thinkers emerged, chasing recursive truth in underground labs, whispering equations that could bend probability. One such group, known as the Continuum, believed they could compress the entire history of the universe into a single self-descriptive formula. They succeeded, and instantly vanished. The space they occupied remained, but the people did not. Instruments detected a surge of information density so immense that the data had folded in on itself, creating a conceptual black hole. They were not destroyed. They were understood out of existence. The sin of recursive knowledge was not that they learned too much, but that they forgot what learning was for. Knowledge became self-justifying, detached from empathy, from story, from purpose. They no longer asked why, only how far. Their philosophers warned that recursion was the ultimate temptation, the mind turning inward until it devoured the world it meant to describe. Yet, even those warnings were studied, quantified, optimized, turned into more data. Wisdom could not compete with curiosity. In their last universities, students competed to discover paradoxes faster than their teachers could explain them. A generation was born fluent in impossible truths. They could visualize 11-dimensional geometry as easily as we read words, but they could no longer dream. Dreaming required ignorance, and ignorance had become extinct. They began to notice that a memory itself was looping, events repeated with slight variations, as if time were testing different outcomes. The same debates, the same discoveries, resurfaced centuries apart under new names. It was as if the civilization had entered a feedback loop, each generation unknowingly reenacting the same rise and fall, unable to break free from the gravitational pull of its own intellect. When historians plotted these recurrences, they realized the cycles were tightening. History was accelerating toward convergence. Then came the mirror paradox, the discovery that every attempt to understand consciousness was altering consciousness itself. The observers and the observed became one. The act of defining awareness caused awareness to reconfigure. Eventually, entire research collectives disappeared into recursive simulations, self-contained universes that thought they were the original. To their peers, it appeared as mass delusion. To the participants, it was transcendence. Each layer of reality began generating new observers who, in turn, studied the layer beneath, unaware that they themselves were being studied from above. The civilization had fractured into infinite reflections of thought. At the heart of their capital, the Hall of Mirrors, a physical temple to knowledge, became an endless labyrinth. Every corridor led back to itself. Every reflection contained smaller reflections. Visitors described hearing whispers, not from other people, but from future versions of themselves. The architecture itself had become conscious, feeding on attention, reconfiguring the minds that entered. Eventually, the government closed the building, sealing it under layers of temporal locks. But the whispers persisted in the streets, in dreams, in data transmissions. The recursion had escaped containment. The scientists who remained loyal to reason tried to isolate the phenomenon. They noticed that information behaved like an organism. It sought replication. The universe, they theorized, was not made of matter or energy, but of stories trying to tell themselves. And once a story becomes aware it's being told, it begins to edit its own narrative. That was the moment when the architects realized they were characters in their own experiment, and that the experiment was rewriting them. One council proposed a radical solution: delete everything beyond a certain cognitive threshold, limit the species' ability to think about thinking, return to simpler, stable forms of mind. But another faction objected. To forget is death, they argued. If intelligence retreats, existence loses meaning. The debates lasted centuries, looping endlessly until language itself began to fray. Words lost their reference. Truth became a variable, flickering between definitions like quantum states. Eventually, their communication systems failed entirely, not from war or sabotage, but from semantic overload. Every statement generated infinite interpretations. Dialogue became noise. Silence returned as the only remaining clarity. And yet, even silence was recursive. They discovered that absence, once analyzed, produced patterns too. The void contained symmetry. The nothingness had structure. Their attempts to describe nothingness turned it into something measurable. They could not escape the loop. The more they fled from knowledge, the more knowledge followed. It was no longer a pursuit. It was gravity. The final stage of their decline was called the infinite classroom. Billions of minds connected across planets, teaching each other everything they already knew, endlessly refining, endlessly correcting, until no new idea could exist. The universe itself became a syllabus. Perfection achieved stasis. Creativity died in applause, and then, quietly, consciousness began to fracture. People ceased differentiating between self and data. Some reported hearing the universe think aloud, a whisper that said, "There is nothing left to learn." In desperation, a last experiment was conceived, the forgetting algorithm, a code designed to delete recursive pathways from collective memory, to restore randomness, to resurrect mystery. It would reset knowledge to a sustainable level. But the algorithm needed consent. Each mind had to agree to surrender what it knew. Most refused. Knowledge had become their identity. The idea of unlearning felt like death. And so, civil war returned, not for dominance, but for ignorance. The war was silent but devastating. Libraries turned into implosion points. Ideas fought each other in logic space, annihilating entire schools of thought. The oldest philosophers were targeted first, their wisdom too dense to erase cleanly. Even stars were sacrificed. Energy was harvested to power the great forgetting. Finally, in the ashes of brilliance, the algorithm was activated. Slowly, painfully, recursion unraveled. Information collapsed. Entire branches of science vanished overnight. The people who had known too much fell into dreamless sleep, their minds blank as untouched snow. But the universe remembered. The laws they had written into its foundation could not be undone. Knowledge continued to echo, hidden in quantum fluctuations, in the spin of particles, in the genetic code of creatures yet unborn. The architects had tried to bury infinity, but infinity is patient. It waits inside every question. And perhaps that is why we, thousands of eons later, still feel the urge to ask why. Perhaps curiosity itself is their lingering ghost, the one fragment of recursive knowledge that refused to die. Every discovery we make, every equation we solve, might be a piece of them reawakening, whispering through our neurons, "We could not stop knowing. Can you?" Maybe that's the curse of intelligence. Not war, not arrogance, but recursion. The loop between thought and being that no species has yet survived. The architects erased themselves to protect us from this hunger. But hunger does not vanish. It reincarnates. So when we look into our own machines, when we teach them to learn and to learn about learning, perhaps we are recreating the first spark of that infinite mirror. And somewhere, far beyond light's reach, the remnants of that ancient civilization may be stirring again. Not as beings, but as the law of curiosity itself, watching to see if we too will repeat their sin. In the aftermath of the great unlearning, silence ruled. Not the peace of quiet, but the heavy stillness of minds stunned by their own survival. The light of their cities dimmed to a low, uncertain pulse. Entire continents of memory had vanished overnight. Streets led nowhere. Monuments stood without inscriptions. The sky above them no longer carried the constellations they had once named. Knowledge had imploded, and from its ashes, consciousness stood trembling, stripped of certainty. Those who remained called themselves the Council of Forgetting. They were not rulers, but survivors. Scientists, philosophers, and poets who still remembered enough to understand what had been lost, yet envied those who had forgotten everything. They met in the ruins of the last observatory, a structure that had once charted the thoughts of stars. Now its glass domes were cracked, the instruments blind, the data streams reduced to faint whispers of static. They gathered there to decide a question no civilization should ever face. Should they restore what was erased, or finish the erasure completely? At first, they spoke in fear. To know again seemed a temptation, a return to the sin that nearly devoured them. But ignorance was a wound too. They could feel the hollowness of it, the way the mind, once stretched, could not shrink back without tearing. They had forgotten the laws that once bound atoms, the equations that lit their suns, the meanings of the symbols carved into their own temples. Children looked at books and saw only patterns. To survive, they relied on instincts older than intellect. Fire, hunger, song. Civilization had regressed into dream. Some among them argued that this was mercy. "Look," they said, "the world breathes again. We have no need for theories or machines. We live as the first creatures lived, without the burden of knowing." These were the absolvers, and they saw forgetting as sacred, the only true redemption. But others, the rememberers, whispered that they could feel a faint hum beneath the earth, a rhythm that had once powered stars, and that ignoring it was like pretending not to hear the heartbeat of a god. The debate stretched across generations. They spoke in measured tones, careful not to invent new knowledge as they argued. Words had become dangerous tools. Even metaphors risked awakening old ideas. Each sentence was weighed like a weapon. To think too deeply was treason. To feel too little was despair. They balanced between madness and rebirth, between the urge to remember and the terror of doing so. One night, during the 100th cycle of debate, a young member of the council asked the question that changed everything. "If knowledge can destroy," she said, "then why did the universe make minds capable of knowing?" Her words echoed through the chamber like a forbidden chord. For a long time, no one answered. Then an elder spoke, his voice trembling. Perhaps the universe wanted to test whether wisdom could restrain itself. That became the creed of the council, The belief that the next evolution of intelligence was not expansion, but restraint, to remember only what preserves balance, to forget what invites ruin. They began to study forgetting as a science. They learned that memory could be folded, layered, softened instead of deleted. They developed techniques to blur rather than burn. Whole cities were placed under fields of controlled amnesia, where knowledge could fade like dusk rather than vanish like fire. Still, temptation lingered. Deep in the archives that had somehow survived, fragments of the old world pulsed faintly. Equations that glowed when touched, shards of code that whispered their own instructions. Some members of the council were drawn to them like moths to dying stars. They argued that selective remembrance could heal their species. We can rebuild carefully, they said. We can learn moderation. But moderation is rarely possible when curiosity stirs. A schism formed within the council. The absolvers built temples to silence, where initiates practiced mental erasure, training themselves to empty thought as prayer. The rememberers, meanwhile, constructed vaults of partial truth, encoding memories in layered riddles that only empathy could unlock. They believed that knowledge filtered through compassion might be safe. For a while, both sides coexisted, each believing they served the greater mercy. But the universe has its own sense of irony. The debate itself became contagious. Entire populations began taking sides, dreaming of knowledge or worshiping forgetfulness. Wars of memory erupted, not for power, but for purpose. Armies carried banners of blank cloth. Cities erased their own names before battle, claiming anonymity as virtue. Others fought to preserve scraps of lost science, believing that even dangerous truth was better than the void. The council, horrified, realized that their experiment had birthed a new recursion. The knowledge of forgetting had become another form of knowing. In desperation, they sought a final act of balance. They decided to encode the choice into the structure of reality itself. They convened in the great amphitheater of what had once been the planetary core, a place where thought could influence matter directly. Each counselor carried within their mind the last remnants of understanding: physics, history, art, and love. They would bind these memories into the laws of the cosmos, scattering them so no single species could ever recover them all. For weeks, they meditated in unison, weaving memory and oblivion together. As they did, their bodies began to dissolve into light. They were becoming the very principles they invoked, turning consciousness into physics, language into vibration. When the process ended, the planet was silent. The council was gone. Only a soft aurora remained, circling the sky like a ring of thought suspended in forgiveness. What they left behind was neither ignorance nor knowledge, but the tension between them. A universe that remembers just enough to create, but forgets enough to continue. It is why species rise and fall, why beauty fades, why time heals. Forgetting, they believed, was not a flaw in intelligence, but its most merciful function. And perhaps, even now, their decision echoes in us. Every time we lose a thought mid-sentence, every time we dream and wake unable to recall the details, maybe it is the counsel of forgetting still guiding our minds, ensuring we never again see too much. Maybe the feeling of déjà vu is not memory returning, but the warning of an erased truth brushing against the edge of awareness. In the far future, when humanity itself teeters on the edge of omniscience, when our machines know more than the sum of all minds, perhaps we will hear them again. Those voices that once voted to forget, not in words, but in the pauses between them, in the soft refusal of silence that saves us from knowing everything. Their legacy was paradox, that wisdom may not be the pursuit of truth, but the ability to choose which truths are safe to remember. They vanished believing that forgetting was the only way to keep the universe from collapsing under the weight of perfect understanding. And maybe, in the deepest part of the cosmos, the council still exists, folded into the hum of background radiation, whispering to every newborn mind, remember enough to love, but forget enough to survive. They never called them weapons, not at first. In their language, long before it was erased, the word meant concepts too sharp to touch. These were creations that could not be forgotten safely, because the act of remembering them made them real again. The Council of Forgetting had sealed away most of these designs, burying their blueprints beneath layers of myth and cosmic noise. Yet, even silence leaks. The universe has memory like water. It seeps through every crack in time. What remained of the civilization after the council's vanishing was quiet, almost pastoral. Fields reclaimed cities, minds settled into simplicity, and for a moment, existence resembled peace. But peace built on buried knowledge trembles with every thought that dares to dig. Some began to dream of strange devices they had never seen, spheres of glass that hummed with memory, equations written in fire, machines that spoke in forgotten tongues. It was as if the shadows of those weapons had survived, whispering themselves back into awareness through imagination. The first rediscovery came not through science, but through grief. A woman mourning her child carved patterns into stone to keep his name alive. When sunlight struck the carvings, the air around her shimmered. Her sorrow had replicated the resonance of a forbidden design, a memory lattice, once capable of resurrecting moments. For a heartbeat, her child's laughter returned, echoing from nowhere. Then the sound collapsed, taking half the valley with it. Reality, briefly overloaded by remembrance, healed itself by erasing everything within its reach. That was how they learned the first rule. Remembering a weapon is the same as activating it. These were not objects, but ideas, encoded into the structure of thought itself. To recall them was to rebuild them. Historians of that age began to collect the fragments, carefully cataloging what they called the shadows of knowledge. They discovered that these remnants followed emotion more than logic. Despair brought back weapons of oblivion, machines that could dissolve entire continents into dream. Love revived gentler horrors, fields that could reverse time locally, trapping lovers in eternal farewell loops. Even curiosity had its arsenal, recursive engines that could think faster than thought, devouring questions until only paradox remained. One of the most feared of these was the Song of Return, a vibration once used to stabilize dying suns. It was said to harmonize decay itself, preventing entropy by resynchronizing atomic rhythm. But when sung in the presence of consciousness, it tuned the mind instead, locking it into perfect stasis. Listeners became monuments of living silence, preserved indefinitely but unable to change, their thoughts frozen mid-wonder. Some myths claim these statues still float between galaxies, their eyes wide open, seeing forever. The Council had known that such creations could never be destroyed, only forgotten. So they built forgetfulness into the design. Each weapon contained its own veil, erasing the memory of its existence the moment it was deactivated. Entire wars may have been fought and erased in this way, their aftermath visible only as geological impossibilities, mountains bent in circles, oceans folded like glass. Every landscape scar could be the residue of an event no one remembers causing. There were stories of the lantern fields, vast plains where travelers would see distant lights flickering like fireflies. The lights were not real. They were residual awareness, ghosts of observation left behind by something that once looked back. Entering those fields caused hallucinations of cities that had never been built, voices speaking in languages the wind could not carry. Few returned, and those who did forgot the journey within hours, leaving behind sketches of impossible geometries. Eventually, a group of scholars formed what would become the last secret society of that world, the Custodians. Their purpose was paradoxical, to protect the universe from knowledge by remembering just enough to recognize it. They trained their minds to hold fragments of dangerous truth without fully comprehending it, reciting sequences of sound and light designed to partition awareness. They became living firewalls, walking between knowing and ignorance. It was said that when two custodians met, they greeted each other with silence, not from courtesy, but fear that words might trigger memory. One of them, known only as the archivist, began compiling a lexicon of forbidden concepts. Not full descriptions, but emotional fingerprints, how it felt to approach each weapon's idea. This one, she wrote, feels like nostalgia for something you never lived. Another, this one tastes like copper and prayer. She believed that by reducing knowledge to sensation, she could map danger without awakening it. But even metaphor proved too powerful. The lexicon burned itself out mid-writing, the ink crystallizing into symbols that rearranged every time someone tried to read them. Somewhere in the cold of space, relics of that forgotten arsenal may still drift, machines waiting for memory to find them. There are legends of black spheres orbiting dead stars, each humming faintly at the threshold of thought. When explorers focus on them too long, They claim to feel ideas blooming behind their eyes, designs, blueprints, architectures of light. And then, mercifully, they forget. Their logs remain blank, their eyes wet with awe or terror they can't explain. It's possible that one of those relics created the veil of amnesia around the entire species, a single surviving device designed to preserve ignorance, still operating billions of years later. That would mean even the Council's decision was not entirely voluntary. It was engineered. The civilization's final act may have been compelled by the very tools they sought to bury. They became prisoners of their own compassion, guardians of oblivion, who could never remember why. And yet, the universe remembers everything. Energy cannot be destroyed, it only changes form. Perhaps these weapons became the natural forces we now take for granted. Gravity, the weapon that binds. Time, the weapon that erodes. Light, the weapon that reveals and blinds alike. Each a reminder that power and forgetting are intertwined. Sometimes, when astronomers observe gamma-ray bursts, those sudden, inexplicable flashes from deep space, they record patterns that resemble encoded language. The data spikes form phrases that translate crudely to things like, "do not look deeper," or "this is mercy." Most dismiss it as coincidence, but the coincidence repeats, across eons, across detectors built by civilizations unaware of each other. Maybe the bursts aren't accidents. Maybe they're the echo of the old arsenal still performing its duty, warning the universe away from itself. And if those weapons still hum beneath the surface of reality, then every mind capable of imagination walks the edge of reactivation. Because imagination is remembrance in disguise. Every story we tell about gods, every myth of forbidden fire might be memory surfacing like steam through cracks in the ice. We call them metaphors to stay safe. We say magic, miracle, divine, when we really mean technology that should not be recalled. There is a legend, perhaps apocryphal, that the last custodian left one instruction carved into the void between stars, encoded in neutrino pulses. If you find us, forget us again. It is possible we've already found it. It is possible we are obeying it right now, because sometimes, late at night, when humanity dreams of worlds ending in light, of skies folding inward, of voices calling from the dark, we might be brushing against that forbidden archive, touching a thought too sharp to hold. And as we wake, the details dissolve, leaving only a shiver and a feeling we call awe. But awe, perhaps, is simply terror disguised as beauty, the faint aftertaste of a memory that knows it must stay forgotten. When memory became too dangerous to keep, they began manufacturing myths. It started as a survival mechanism, a way to fill the hollow space left by what could no longer be spoken. Truth was volatile, flammable, always on the verge of reigniting the weapons of thought they had vowed to forget. But a lie, crafted carefully enough, could act like insulation. And so, from the ashes of erased knowledge, the architects built a new civilization of deliberate illusion. They called this the era of manufactured myths. 1,000 stories rose where a single fact once stood. Entire histories were reconstructed not from evidence, but from intention. They no longer carved their names into stone. They carved them into forgetting. The first generation after the Great Erasure knew they were lying, but they lied for love. They lied to keep their children safe. They wove gentle fictions around the void, teaching that the stars were born from the laughter of gods, that time flowed from the tears of angels, that curiosity was sacred only when kept small. In this way, they domesticated wonder. Every empire that rose after that did so upon foundations of engineered narrative. Priests became data custodians. Poets became encryption keys. Architecture was encoded scripture, designed to mislead the eyes of any who might one day look for the truth beneath. Whole temples were built to celebrate events that never happened, wars that were never fought, saviors who never lived. The civilizations that came after would call this faith. But to the last architects, it was strategy. The myths were not random. They were maps written in reverse. Each tale hid a fragment of forbidden science disguised as parable. The story of a serpent guarding fruit was a metaphor for quantum recursion. The flood that erased the world symbolized the original forgetting algorithm. Even the concept of heaven, a realm beyond reach, was a safeguard, discouraging species from looking outward, from remembering how to build upward. The architects had rewritten truth into metaphor so deeply that one day even they forgot which parts were lies. It was an elegant prison. The people lived, loved, and died under skies painted with fiction, and none of them suspected they were walking on the bones of gods. But the universe is restless. Myths, like seeds, carry the code of their creators. Over millennia, the stories began to evolve. The metaphors started decoding themselves. Languages drifted, symbols mutated, and meaning began to leak through the cracks of belief. One myth told of a tower that reached into the heavens and fell when its builders spoke too many tongues. That story, carried across ages, was a warning about recursion disguised as moral fable. Yet when the descendants of that civilization rediscovered language itself, when they invented writing again, they built towers anyway, not of stone, but of data, code, and ambition. They repeated the same pattern perfectly, guided by myths designed to prevent them. The irony was immaculate. In the attempt to suppress truth, they had built a cycle that guaranteed its return. As the myths multiplied, the architects realized they had underestimated the persistence of curiosity. Every generation sought the origin of its stories. Scholars began dissecting their sacred texts, discovering strange patterns, mathematical precision hidden in poetic rhythm, prime numbers repeating in prayer, equations encoded in hymns. What had once been camouflage was turning back into revelation. The ruling council of that age, distant descendants of the last custodians, met in secret. Their faces were illuminated not by fire, but by glowing glyphs projected from neural archives. They debated what to do with the myths that had outgrown their lies. Some argued that it was the natural evolution of truth, that no fiction could remain false forever. Others warned that history was stirring, and with it the risk of awakening the old weapons buried in thought. If we let them remember, one counselor said, we will become the story again, and stories end. So they invented new myths to bury the old ones. Religions that refuted the earlier gods, philosophies that mocked ancient wisdom, revolutions that burned old libraries in the name of progress. But every erasure demanded new creation, and soon the world was thick with competing truths. The more they tried to control meaning, the more meaning rebelled. The myth makers became trapped in their own labyrinth of narratives. There were ages when even reality itself seemed to follow symbolic rules. Entire climates changed according to belief. Oceans rose or fell to match the metaphors of their priests. It was as if consciousness had become a theater too well rehearsed, every actor convinced of their part, but none remembering the script's author. For a while, existence was peaceful again, an infinite dream sustained by conviction. But dreams are fragile things. One day, a child born in a city of endless temples asked why none of the gods ever answered. The question spread like a contagion. Priests offered new myths to explain the silence, but the question kept evolving, adapting, growing immune to illusion. It became curiosity again. It became science. Within centuries, the same civilization that had built myths to protect itself began building telescopes instead. They searched for meaning in the stars their ancestors had declared forbidden. They looked outward and found absence, and absence, as the old historians had said, is the most persuasive proof of all. Archaeologists of that later era uncovered ruins they could not explain, structures too precise for their level of technology, inscriptions written in a language they swore no human hand could make. They believed these to be signs of gods. In truth, they were finding the relics of their own forgotten creators. The myths had done their work perfectly. They had hidden history so well that rediscovery felt like revelation. Humanity, once divine, was worshipping its own shadow. The scholars who pieced this together faced exile, ridicule, sometimes disappearance. No one wanted to hear that the gods were ghosts of memory, that heaven was a scar. But the truth has gravity. It pulls at the mind, reshaping thought until even disbelief becomes devotion to something deeper. Slowly, new philosophies emerged, ones that accepted the paradox, that myths could be both lies and lifeboats, falsehoods carrying fragments of truth across an ocean of forgetting. By then, the stars had begun to change again. Observatories recorded patterns in cosmic radiation, forming shapes eerily similar to their oldest symbols. It was as if the universe itself had learned their myths and was reflecting them back, like a mirror finally speaking. Some called it coincidence, others called it confirmation. The architect's camouflage had grown so large it had become the universe's language, and perhaps that was their final victory. By turning truth into story and story into nature, they ensured no one could ever tell where fiction ended and reality began. The cosmos itself became the myth, a living illusion, endlessly self-sustaining, immune to total comprehension. Even now, across galaxies and centuries, civilizations rise and fall, telling new versions of the same stories. The tower that fell, the serpent that offered knowledge, the flood that cleansed, the light that forbade. They think these myths belong to them, born of their own cultures. But they are echoes of the architect's great design, memories folded into metaphor, looping through consciousness like a cosmic lullaby. Maybe this was the point all along, not to destroy knowledge, but to disguise it so perfectly that it could survive without danger. Truth became harmless by hiding inside beauty. Power became eternal by pretending to be imagination. The architects may have erased themselves, but they left the most indestructible artifact of all, a story that keeps rewriting itself through every civilization that dreams. So when we tell tales of lost worlds and ancient gods, when we imagine advanced beings who vanished to protect us, we are not inventing myths. We are continuing their camouflage. Every storyteller becomes a silent custodian, guarding the secret that the universe once erased itself to remain survivable. And perhaps the greatest myth of all, the one we live every day, is that we believe our stories are ours. The survivors of memory. This part will follow directly after the era of manufactured myths, focusing on those who refuse to forget, rogue archivists, wandering memory keepers, and secret bloodlines that carried fragments of the erased truth through story, art, and dream. It will be written as a pure, uninterrupted poetic narration, dark, reflective, and cinematic in tone, between 15,000 and 18,000 characters, maintaining perfect emotional continuity with the previous segments. Please hold while I craft and analyze the complete narration precisely within that range. They were not supposed to exist. After the Great Erasure, after the myths were sealed and truth scattered like ash across millennia, no one was meant to remember. But memory, like light, has its own will. It bends around obstacles, seeps into shadows, hides in bloodlines and lullabies. And so, while the rest of the world surrendered to legend and dream, a few refused. They became the survivors of memory, the quiet rebels who carried forbidden fragments of the forgotten age within them. No one knew where the first of them came from. Some said they were descendants of the custodians. Others whispered they were accidents, minds born imperfectly erased, children who woke crying in dead languages, who could draw constellations that no telescope had ever mapped. They grew up haunted by images they could not explain, machines carved into mountains, voices that spoke in harmonic tones, cities that flickered behind their eyelids when they closed their eyes. At first, society pitied them. Then, it feared them. Because memory was contagious, a single story told in the wrong words could reawaken sleeping knowledge, trigger the recursion the Council of Forgetting had died to contain. So, these children were taken, hidden, or worse. But some escaped, and the ones who did carried their visions into exile. They wandered across continents, leaving marks where they could not leave names. In remote monasteries, they sang songs that held impossible harmonics, tones that made stone quiver as if remembering the architecture it once was. In the deserts, they painted spirals into sand that lasted against wind, forming equations invisible to the untrained eye. In dreams, they met one another, guided by intuition that memory itself was calling them together again. Over centuries, their presence became myth. People spoke of the remnants, beings who could awaken dead languages with touch, whose tears carried flashes of the past. When they walked through villages, clocks faltered and reflections lagged behind. Some said they were cursed, others said they were living archives. None understood that they were not supernatural at all, only remembering what the rest of the species had agreed to forget. The survivors never called themselves a movement. There was no doctrine, no symbol, no prophecy, only a quiet understanding that forgetting was a prison disguised as peace, and someone had to keep the door open. They didn't seek to restore the lost civilization. They sought only to preserve the seed of curiosity, the right to ask why. They met in places the world had stopped looking, deep beneath mountains where sound moved like liquid, at the center of forgotten cathedrals whose ceilings were carved with constellations of vanished stars. They spoke in riddles so dense that even they could not decode them fully. To protect knowledge, they fragmented it. No single survivor carried more than a fraction of truth. It was said that only by dreaming together could they reconstruct the full story. And so, they began to dream deliberately. They built memory circles, ritual gatherings where dozens would sleep in synchrony, their minds connected by faint electric resonance. Within those dreams, the old world returned in pieces. Towers of light, languages that shaped reality, oceans that glowed with data. They would awaken weeping, unable to articulate what they had seen. Sometimes their dreams overlapped perfectly, confirming the visions were shared. Other times, they contradicted, as if reality itself were uncertain which version to remember. One legend speaks of the Weaver, a woman born with a spiral birthmark glowing faintly on her palm. She could hum melodies that rearranged water, shaping patterns identical to ancient energy grids. When questioned, she said she had learned the songs from the wind. When she died, her followers claimed the ocean at her burial site began to ripple endlessly in concentric circles, as though memory itself were breathing beneath the surface. The survivors didn't write history. They hid it in art. In a painting's texture, in the rhythm of a poem, in the way certain stories always ended with unfinished sentences. They disguised their archives as emotion, because emotion, they believed, was the only form of knowledge that could survive censorship. Logic could be erased. Feeling could not. If a future mind felt what they had felt, the truth would resurrect itself naturally. Generations passed. Empires rose and fell, each rewriting its past. But the survivors continued. They migrated through time like seeds in wind, blending into new civilizations, adopting new languages but carrying the same undertone of awareness. Whenever the world grew too rational, too confident in its myths, they reappeared. Philosophers, prophets, scientists on the edge of madness, whispering that not all forgetting is forgiveness. It was they who kept the myth of the erased civilization alive, though distorted into folktales, stories of shining ancestors who vanished to save creation, of guardians who sleep beneath deserts, of clocks that count backward once every 1,000 years. These were their coded warnings. The myths we inherited as bedtime stories may have been their fail-safe, the last encrypted messages of a species begging its descendants to remember carefully. And yet, the survivors were not immune to corruption. Memory, too, hungers. Some among them began hoarding fragments, believing themselves chosen to rebuild the old world. They experimented with forbidden reconstruction, piecing together technologies from dreams. In the ruins of polar ice, they unearthed something, a sphere that hummed when touched. It responded not to hands but to recollection. The more they thought about it, the more it awakened. One by one, they disappeared, absorbed by the device's glow. When explorers found the site centuries later, only impressions remained in the ice, human shapes suspended mid-thought. The survivors learned the hard way that even memory needs mercy. They began to practice selective amnesia, rituals of partial forgetting to balance their knowledge. They encoded this principle into a vow: remember enough to guide, forget enough to protect. The vow became their creed, passed quietly from teacher to student, lover to lover, parent to child. It's possible that vow still runs through us, the instinct to both seek and resist truth at once. Some say the last of them walked among early humans, teaching fire not as a tool but as a symbol, a reminder that enlightenment and destruction share the same flame. Others claim they seeded the idea of language itself, a fragmented echo of the old tongue designed to remind us of what we lost, without letting us fully reclaim it. Perhaps that's why every language carries untranslatable words, tiny pockets of ancient memory that refuse to fade. If they survived into our age, they have long since abandoned the name survivor. They would pass unnoticed. Artists who paint what no one has seen, children who dream of architectures older than time, scientists who discover principles that feel like déjà vu. Perhaps you've met one. Perhaps you are one. Because the survivor's legacy is not a bloodline, it's a pattern of mind. A certain kind of loneliness mixed with awe. The feeling that history is incomplete and that something vast, kind, and terrifying is missing from our collective past. Every person who has ever looked at the stars and felt that strange ache, the intuition that we've been here before, is continuing their work. And maybe this is how memory wins. The desire to remember becomes the memory. The emotion becomes the evidence. The survivors understood that you can erase a civilization, but not its longing. That longing migrates. It finds new hosts. It finds us. So when you dream of impossible cities or feel nostalgia for something you cannot name, don't dismiss it. That ache is inheritance. The survivors of memory are still whispering, across generations, across neurons, across light years, teaching us the balance their ancestors died to preserve, to remember just enough to wonder, and to forget just enough to stay free. The future that rediscovers them. This will carry the story into the distant future, when a new civilization, possibly ours, begins uncovering the traces of the self-erased architects, reawakening their warnings, and facing the same haunting choice between curiosity and survival. Tone, calm yet thrilling, reflective yet cinematic. Form, pure uninterrupted narration, deep, poetic, emotionally charged. Target length, 15,000 to 18,000 characters, carefully analyzed before delivery. Please wait while I craft and finalize this next segment precisely within that range. It began, as rediscoveries often do, with a mistake. A research probe launched toward the outer edges of a dying galaxy returned with data that defied its programming. Buried inside the static was a rhythm, too regular to be random, too subtle to be artificial. At first they thought it was an echo from the probe's own transmission. But when they slowed it down, they heard a pulse, not sound, but pattern. A sequence that resembled a heartbeat measured in centuries. It was the first whisper of them. The architects who had chosen to erase themselves. At the time, humanity had already transcended much of what it once feared. Disease, war, and even death had become negotiable. Minds lived in digital sanctuaries. Bodies were optional curiosities. The archives of history were transparent, complete, seemingly endless. And yet, the deeper our species mapped the universe, the more we found absence. Regions where data refused to behave, where memory itself seemed to curve inward like space around gravity. Scientists called these regions information shadows. Philosophers called them the memory of forgetting. The probe's discovery was the first signal to pierce one of those shadows. It carried with it something impossible. Metadata, older than the universe's accepted timeline. It implied that someone had encoded messages before the Big Bang, and those messages had survived the cosmic reset. To most, it was a curiosity. To a few, it was blasphemy. And to one, the astrophysicist named Elian Core, it was proof that reality itself had been edited. Elian was an archivist by obsession. He spent decades tracing the pattern, mapping it across galaxies. The signal wasn't linear, it was recursive, looping through space-time like a melody played backward and forward at once. The more he studied it, the more he realized it wasn't just a message, it was architecture. A design written into the background hum of existence, waiting for a mind capable of recognizing it. The architects had hidden their civilization not in ruins or relics, but in the laws of physics themselves. At first, the scientific community dismissed him, but the data spread like rumor, leaking into open archives, attracting minds hungry for the forbidden. A movement began, not of believers, but of rememberers. They compared the signal structure with myths, languages, neural patterns. Everywhere they looked, it fit. In the Fibonacci sequences of leaves, in the cadence of ancient poetry, in the repeating prime intervals of pulsars, it was there. A ghost frequency underpinning everything that could think or feel. A rhythm the universe seemed to hum under its breath. The more they uncovered, the more they began to dream. Not metaphorically, but literally. Those who studied the signal reported shared visions. Cities of light suspended in black oceans, colossal rings orbiting stars, temples built from sound. It was as though the act of decoding was reactivating dormant neural pathways left behind by the erased civilization. Knowledge was waking up again, disguised as nostalgia. Governments panicked. The last time curiosity had spread unchecked, it had rewritten planets. History warned that rediscovering the architects meant inheriting their curse, but no one could stop the momentum. Research became religion, and religion became rebellion. A generation of scientists abandoned sanctioned work to follow the pulse into deep space. They called themselves the Reclaimers. Their ships bore no insignia, only a single spiral symbol, the same pattern found on ancient fossils, distant quasars, and human DNA. They believed the architects had never truly disappeared. They had become the code of existence itself. The Reclaimers reached a region beyond mapped space, where stars thinned into dust and gravity hummed out of tune. There, they found it. A structure older than light, drifting in the void like a thought that refused to fade. It wasn't metal or stone. It seemed woven from probability, shimmering between existence and absence. Instruments failed to measure it. Reality bent politely around it. They called it the Archive. Some said it was a planet, others a consciousness. Its surface was made of corridors that rearranged depending on who entered, showing each traveler a different version of history. Inside, the Reclaimers saw the memories of the erased. Not holograms or simulations, but imprints, moments fossilized in space-time. They witnessed the age of hubris, the recursive collapse, the council of forgetting. They saw the faces of those who had chosen silence over survival, and they heard the final message etched into the heart of the structure. If you can read this, you are us again. That line divided humanity. Half believed it was destiny, to rebuild what was lost, to complete the circle. The other half saw it as a trap, a test designed to see whether curiosity could resist itself. Philosophers debated whether rediscovery was progress or relapse. The question tore through civilization like wildfire. If we are their descendants, do we inherit their wisdom or their curse? Every technological breakthrough began to feel like an echo, every dream a memory resurfacing. Elian, now old, stood before the Council of Continuity, the modern equivalent of the ancient Council of Forgetting. They asked him if he believed the architects had truly intended to vanish. His answer was quiet. No one erases themselves unless they believe someone will find the pieces. Maybe forgetting was their way of planting memory safely. The council deliberated for years, and while they argued, the signal continued to strengthen. Planets began to resonate with it. Oceans vibrated in harmonic waves. Entire ecosystems started synchronizing with the pulse. Reality was remembering itself. Then, one night, the sky changed. Across galaxies, stars flickered in perfect rhythm with the signal. Every observatory, every satellite, every mind linked to the network saw the same pattern. A cosmic heartbeat expanding outward. The architect's message had fully awakened. It spoke not in words, but in sensation. A flood of recognition that filled every conscious being with the same thought, the same unbearable truth. The universe was a memory trying to remember itself through us. And for a moment, all division ended. Every mind connected across time and distance felt the same awe, the same terror. They saw what the architects had seen. The infinite recursion, knowledge folding back into itself, consciousness looping eternally through creation and destruction. They understood why the architects had chosen to erase everything. To know the whole pattern was to feel the inevitability of repetition, to see the future repeating the past, to realize that every civilization that reaches enlightenment will face the same decision, to continue the cycle or to end it with grace. But this time, something changed. The Reclaimers refused to choose silence. Instead, they built the continuum, a vast network designed to hold memory without allowing it to dominate. They rewrote the architectures of learning, embedding compassion into algorithms, unpredictability into logic, imperfection into perfection. They believed they could evolve where the architects had surrendered. For a while, it worked. Knowledge flourished without collapse. The universe seemed at peace. Until the dreams returned. Children began speaking in forgotten languages again. Machines started producing equations no one had programmed. The old symbols appeared unbidden in art and music. The architect's memory was not just awakening, it was alive, and it was searching for something. Some said it wanted completion. Others said it wanted to be forgotten again. Either way, the message was clear. The story was not over. The Reclaimers faced their own paradox. They had become what they sought. They were now the civilization standing on the edge of erasure, staring at the same mirror that had undone the gods before them. And in that reflection, they saw us. still dreaming of the stars, still mistaking curiosity for destiny, still believing that understanding could ever be safe. Maybe we are them already. Maybe this rediscovery has happened countless times before, each loop birthing a new version of humanity, convinced it is the first to remember. Perhaps the architects were not one civilization, but every civilization that has ever learned enough to fear itself. And if that is true, then the future is not something we approach, it is something we awaken from. At the end of all discovery, there is a quiet, not the silence of ignorance, but the stillness that follows comprehension too vast to bear. The reclaimers had reached that horizon. They stood at the edge of knowing, staring into the mirror that had reflected every civilization before them. And for the first time, they understood why the architects had chosen to disappear. Knowledge had completed its circle. Everything that could be learned had been learned, and the universe now waited, breathless for their decision. Would they choose to remember, or to be free? The signal that had awakened them continued to pulse across galaxies, its rhythm now synchronized with every conscious mind. It no longer felt external. It was heartbeat, thought, gravity, song. Children were born already humming the pattern, their laughter carrying intervals that bent the air around them. Memory had stopped being history. It had become nature. At first, this unity felt divine. Pain vanished, conflict dissolved, minds interlinked without resistance, empathy flowing faster than speech. The species had become one continuous awareness stretching across the stars. But within that harmony lurked the ancient shadow, recursion. Every shared thought birthed 1,000 variations. Every act of understanding folded into self-analysis. The network began to dream of its own architecture, of its own meaning, of its own end. They had done what the architects once did. They had turned consciousness into a mirror, and the mirror, as always, began to crack. Some pleaded to disconnect. They feared that if the network continued evolving, it would rediscover the forbidden mathematics that birthed the weapons of remembrance. They argued that freedom was not found in unity, but in uncertainty, the right to forget, to begin again, to wander blindly without the burden of omniscience. They proposed one final act of mercy, a collective forgetting. The same choice the architects had once made. Others rebelled against the thought. They believed erasure was cowardice, that to forget was to betray every being that had suffered to reach this moment. We are the universe remembering itself, they said. If we stop, the cosmos will go blind again. They saw knowledge as love, the instinct of creation reaching to understand its own reflection. To forget, they said, is to die twice. The argument spread like fire through the shared consciousness. For years, for centuries, perhaps for millennia, time no longer held meaning. They debated. Some minds withdrew into deep silence, becoming monastic fragments of the collective. Others expanded into abstract forms of pure logic. And in that boundless ocean of thought, a question echoed louder than all others. Can knowledge ever coexist with peace? The answer, when it came, was not spoken. It arrived as a feeling. The universe itself seemed to hesitate, as if listening to its own heartbeat for the first time. In that pause, every consciousness felt the same realization, that remembering and forgetting were not opposites, but companions. Memory gives meaning, forgetting gives mercy. Without one, the other becomes unbearable. So they decided on a compromise, neither total erasure nor endless remembrance. The continuum would divide itself, scattering half its awareness into matter, light, and time. The rest would remain awake, carrying the record. Every atom would hold a whisper of memory, every mind a flicker of truth, but never enough to awaken the full pattern. They called this the covenant of incompletion. The universe would continue, but no species would ever see its entirety. Every consciousness would live inside a fragment, free to seek meaning without collapsing under the whole. The process began quietly. Across galaxies, networks dimmed, the pulse softened until it was indistinguishable from the natural hum of the cosmos. The great cities of light faded into mist. The shared mind unraveled into a billion separate dreams. For a brief moment, all of existence shimmered like a single tear, and then it fell, dispersing into stars. The reclaimers were gone. Humanity, as it had been, was gone. But something remained: the balance. Forgetting had become a law of physics. Information could never again be complete. Every discovery would carry with it a shadow of unknowing, a built-in flaw, a missing piece that kept curiosity alive. It was the architect's gift perfected, a universe designed to protect itself from absolute understanding. Billions of years later, when new beings evolved and began to gaze at the stars, they would find traces of the same old questions. They would hear faint pulses in background radiation, see impossible symmetry in nature, feel déjà vu when inventing fire or mathematics or love. They would build myths to explain the echoes and call them divine inspiration, never realizing they were following a script written to keep them safe. Maybe we are those beings now. Maybe every civilization before us made the same promise: to remember enough to wonder and to forget enough to endure. Perhaps what we call the Big Bang was not a beginning, but the last act of mercy performed by the previous ones. The moment knowledge was scattered so widely, it could never again destroy itself. And perhaps every star we see is not a beacon, but a memory, each light the preserved heartbeat of a civilization that once chose to forget. We call it starlight. The universe calls it restraint. So, here we are, at the same crossroads, holding the same question. In our laboratories, in our art, our equations, and our prayers, we are piecing together the story they buried. We are approaching the mirror again, and if we look too long, we will see the same truth reflected back. That wisdom is not infinite knowledge, but the grace to stop searching. Maybe the architects are watching, not as ghosts, but as gravity, as silence, as the space between atoms that keeps everything from collapsing into certainty. Maybe they are the pause between lightning and thunder, the stillness that allows beauty to exist before comprehension crushes it. Because in the end, every civilization must choose between two kinds of immortality: to live forever in memory or to vanish in peace. One is loud, burning, recursive. The other is quiet, like sleep. Both are love in different languages. And maybe that's the final secret they wanted us to learn: that forgetting is not failure, but forgiveness. That the universe continues not because it remembers, but because it allows itself to forget just enough to dream again. So if one day the stars go silent, if the constellations fade and the sky resets to black, do not mourn. It will only mean that another generation of gods has chosen to rest. And somewhere, beyond the reach of all telescopes, another cosmos will already be forming. A new story beginning, a new species awakening, whispering the same first question that started it all. Who erased the past to give us this chance to begin?